Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome. We're so excited to have you here for this evening's webinar, Eyes on the Street, Jewish Photographers Picture Post-War New York with Deborah Dash Moore. Before we get started, we'll do a quick introduction and some Zoom protocol. But right now, if you have a moment, just go ahead into the chat and drop in a message of where you're tuning in from. We love to know where everyone is coming from. But to let you know a little bit more about village preservation, if you are not familiar with us, we were founded in 1980 and we're dedicated to documenting, celebrating, and preserving the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. We've secured landmark designation for more than 1,250 buildings in our neighborhood and over 100 blocks of zoning protections as well. Now, we host about 75 free programs like this throughout the year. So, membership for us is incredibly important. If you are a member, thank you very much. You help make all of this possible. If you are not yet a member, go ahead and scan that QR code that you see on the screen right now, and it will take you to where you can sign up and become a member. Makes a great last minute holiday gift as well if you are interested. So for a little Zoom protocol, as I said, please feel free to send message in the chat and such. But if you do have a question for today's guest, please pop those into the Q&A feature, which you'll see the little Q&A button. And then we're going to collect all of those questions throughout the program. And then at the end, we'll be asking those questions on behalf of you. All right. Now for this evening's guest. Today we are joined by Deborah Dash Moore, who is the Frederick G. Huetwell Professor of History and Professor of Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She's a historian of American Jews specializing in the 20th century urban history. Her previous book, Walkers in the City Jewish Street, or her current book, Walkers in the City Jewish Street Photographers of Mid-Century New York, extends her interest in urban Jewish history to photography. And we're excited to be talking about that today. And currently, she serves as the editor-in-chief to the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, a 10-volume anthology of original sources translated into English from the biblical period to 2005 and selected by leading scholars. So Professor Moore, it is fantastic to have you here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then I will let you take it away.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, William. I'm going to share my screen momentarily, but I have a couple of words to say in terms of introduction. And I want to begin by, as it were, affirming my Greenwich Village bona fides, because when I first got married, we moved to 10th, the corner of 10th Street and Bleecker in a very modest apartment that it was 3 rooms, but my husband, who was over 6 feet, could, if he stretched his arms out, reach the walls on each of the rooms, right? So they weren't particularly large. All right. So I do know from living in it for a while, back in the last century, some things about the village. The other thing I want to say in beginning is that I'm going to take you back in time, and in doing that, the the village that we're going to be looking at wasn't called the village back then, right? It had other names. And I think, what exists today in the 21st century is different from what existed in the 1940s. Okay, so let's get on with the talk. The title, Eyes on the Street, comes from the great urbanist Jane Jacobs, who lived in Greenwich Village for many years before moving to Canada. In her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, she wrote about the importance of eyes on the street for the maintenance of urban quality of life. Reformers, she noted, have long observed city people loitering on busy corners, hanging around in candy stores and bars, and drinking soda pop on stoops, and have passed a judgment, the gist of which is, this is deplorable. Jacobs begged to disagree. The tolerance, the room for great differences among neighbors are possible and normal in intensely urban life, but only, she warned, when streets of great cities have built-in equipment allowing strangers to dwell in peace together on civilized but essentially dignified and reserved terms. So I'm going to take you back to New York City during the years before Jacobs wrote her book in the 1950s. We're going to visit post-war New York, a time when the city was booming. Wartime prosperity overcame the difficult years of the Depression. The garment industry, employing 350,000 workers, reached its peak in 1947. Despite a steady decline throughout the following decade, 15 years later, it still produced 28% of the nation's clothing. New construction altered the cityscape, funded in part by government investment in public housing, bridges and tunnels, parks, schools, not to mention airports, of course. The city tore down the last of the elevated trains in 1955, opening 3rd Avenue to sunlight. A sense of prosperity pervaded New York. Printing and publishing flourished, sustaining a growing appetite for photographs. But first, we need to remember that certainly by the fall of 1943, most New Yorkers had a family member, a son, brother, father, uncle, cousin in military service. At that point, Allied troops had landed in Italy, beginning the invasion of the European mainland. Many Jewish photographers, I'll mention a bunch of names here, Sid Grossman, Morris Engel, Louis Fora, Walter Rosenblum, Louis Stetner, Dan Wiener, enlisted or were drafted into the armed forces. The women remained and continued to photograph on the streets. These men and women met at a place called the New York Photo League, which was located on East 21st Street, north of Union Square. Organized in 1936, the League offered its members developing, printing, and exhibition facilities. It was a great place to argue, flirt, share job leagues. The League was a cooperative, a photo club on a mission. Working alone and in groups, young photographers sought to help fellow New Yorkers better appreciate how they were connected and separated by such variables as age, gender, class, ethnicity, and race. Their ambitious agenda was feasible because a photograph grants each viewer a license to stare, to contemplate, potentially intrigued, annoyed, sympathetic, judgmental, even moved to action. The Photo League exhibited photographs at their modest home base, but also in neighborhoods where League photographers had been working. They caught, winnowed, and selectively shared their images of urban interactions. They made exhilarating, unsettling contributions to street photography, reframing the routine improvisations of being among other people in the city. And those of you who live in New York, of course, know all about this, right? Because you go through this every day. Together, they produced multifaceted, coherent accounts of street life in their rapidly changing metropolis. During the war years, the photographer Sonia Handelman-Meyer remembered what had been a very quiet, peaceful darkroom gallery. Then, after the war, everything at the League changed because all the men came back. Everything suddenly burst open and people just poured into the place. So now I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this will work. Okay. And let you take a look at some of the photographs here. All right. Let's see. Yeah, we got that. All right. That's good. Oh, do you see William Roca's thing in the do I need to move him or not? I'll move him over here. Okay, everybody can see NJ Jaffe, yes? All right. Let me know if at any point you can't see something. All right. All right. So among these newcomers was NJ Jaffe. Jaffe served 3 years in the infantry during World War II, seeing combat in the European theater. His politics were progressive. He enlisted to defeat Nazism and fascism. After returning to civilian life and marrying, he found himself at loose ends. His older brother encouraged him in 1947 to purchase his first camera, a Kodak monitor. In those years, he lived in East New York, Brooklyn, but in 1948, he took a class with Sid Grossman, a photographer and founder of the Photo League. The class was held at Local 65, the Wholesale and Warehouse Union's hall at Astor Place in Lower Manhattan. The union had become a center for progressive political action in the metropolitan area. Its members never tired of demonstrating for one cause or another. District 65 had a camera club, however, originally part of its recreation program. So the photo you're looking at, Shoeshine Conversation, New York City downtown, 1949, records an exchange between two men. Men took over the business of shining shoes in New York City in the early years of the 20th century, pushing child bootblacks into more marginal areas. It used to be a kid's job. Jaffe's photograph, most likely taken at Astor Place in Manhattan, pays equal attention to customer and seller. Shoeshine Conversation pulls back from the labor involved in shining shoes to emphasize the interaction. The customer, in this case, appears to be haranguing the shoeshine man, who smiles affably. He is not going to alienate his patron if he wants to be paid. The bootblack's subservience is obvious. The shoeshine man has carried a wooden chair out onto the sidewalk so that his clients would be comfortable. He kneels on an old cushion. Jaffe's photograph conveys the labor as well as the financial investment involved in this form of street commerce. Without a shoeshine stand, the bootblack makes do with a chair for his customer and his box with supplies. He has chosen a spot not far from the corner to set up his business near a subway exit. Italian immigrants came to dominate both the shoeshine and shoe repair businesses in the city in the decades straddling World War II. Many years later, Jaffe explained that his post-war photographs, although not mainly political, revealed my sympathies. They are of working people and their surroundings, people who lived ordinary, unglamorous lives. Jaffe's photographs were, and he quotes, I quote him, a reflection of who I was. To photograph them was a way of ennobling their existence and affirming my own. So not far from Astor Place on Lafayette Street stood the old Astor Library, now home to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS. Today, you would recognize the building as the Public Theater. The area was still considered part of the Lower East Side in those years, although by the 1960s, of course, its nomenclature and character shifted to being part of the East Village. One warm summer day, Handleman Meyer walked by HIAS. She saw the sign and peered through a gate. It looked so interesting. So she walked in, and it was more interesting than I thought, she recalled. She started to take pictures of the people, such as this photograph of several women, some with young children. The women standing around, including one who appears to be talking, may be using the opportunity while waiting to discuss domestic responsibilities. Their gendered roles and responsibilities for children prompt conversation, unlike the men who appear to have less reason to converse. Behind the railing, some men grip the iron bars. Their posture suggests a measure of boredom and perhaps frustration. Visually, the men behind the railings and the women in the foreground give the photograph a compelling and slightly disturbing quality. Hayes, which still exists today, was founded to assist Jewish immigrants to the United States and helped Holocaust survivors and refugees after the war. Handelman Meyer knew the organization's purpose. As she drew closer, she pictured the mix of Jewish refugees waiting for aid, right? And here's another shot here of two kids, right? The boy and a girl, they sit together on an upended crate. The girl leans back, settled in with her legs crossed. She holds a crumpled paper bag in her hands and gazes directly at Handelman Meyer. The boy, perched on a corner of the crate, seems anxious. His position does not suggest comfort. If the girl appears cautiously relaxed, the boy looks uncomfortably alert. Both present a serious demeanor. They are not involved in any sort of play. They are well behaved, placid. Wearing clean and lovely clothes, they know not to engage in the sort of activity that might dirty themselves. They apparently also know the rules of waiting and follow them carefully. One gets the sense that they have refined this act of waiting despite their youth. Although they sit in Hayes's courtyard and not in a cold government hallway or outside on the street before a consulate, they implicitly seem to grasp how difficult it was to make it to New York City after a genocidal war. Nothing apparently is taken for granted. Two children face the photographer with an intensity in their looks that speaks to their unusual maturity and their experiences as survivors of the Holocaust that may have produced it. Now, a group of older adults similarly display such skills. The old man with a traditional beard, a middle-aged married woman garbed in a long skirt and blouse with her hair covered, and a younger man wearing a cap stared directly at the photographer. The old man, a faint smile dancing on his lips, grasps a shopping cart in his right hand, as if he had merely paused between ordinary errands. This portrait of three generations, two of them visibly observant Jews, obscures the destruction wrought by the Holocaust. Yet it also evokes the social costs of exile and emigration, the painfully long wait for visas, passage, help, food, and home, not to mention a livelihood. The historian Beth Cohen argues that the pictures of survivors actually show a rupture of Jewish life, vast and deep, a plethora of 30-year-old widowers, couples joined together to replace murdered wives and children, youngsters never reaching adolescence, young adults facing life alone. Jewish agencies like Hayes, she charged, interpreted the men, women, and children seeking help as evidence of resilience, a will to live and begin again. And certainly, I think one sees that in this beautiful photograph, right? Handelman Meyer's photograph of a bench filled with young mothers and their children appears to support the evidence of regeneration. They are all attired in summer dresses. The children who sit on the women's laps are clean and properly dressed. Two women fuss over a pretty blonde girl sporting a big bow in her hair who pays attention to the photographer. Cohen suggests that the data, and by implication the photographs, speak, if we listen closely, about families shattered rather than about those reconstituted, cautioning us to remember the black thread of the Holocaust that continued to weave its way through the immigrants' lives even as they moved forward. Four women, each with a young child, sit on a line of benches outside of Hayes, a picture of Jewish efforts to reclaim life after the Holocaust. Jewish refugees drew upon past experiences and, we might say, expert skill at waiting in line. Getting out meant standing on never-ending lines, the historian Marion Kaplan has emphasized. These sites demanded perseverance and resilience from battered people. Yet, for refugees, these lines represented a foreign state, potential rescue, and a new world. Now they were waiting at Hayes in line, as New Yorkers like to put it, in New York City. The stakes had declined significantly. No danger of arrest lurked. So I took pictures, Handelman-Meyer remembered. Not one person asked me what I was doing. Why are you here? What are you doing here? Nothing. A couple of people smiled. Their seeming passivity surprised her. It was weird. I took the pictures. I said goodbye to nobody. Nobody answered. Her memories address the gulf that existed between these new Americans, as Jews optimistically called them, and New York Jews, even those who were conscious of the political dimensions of the Holocaust and empathetic with its human costs, as Handelman-Meyer was. She had grown up in New York, the youngest child of a family of 5 daughters. With her father not always present, her mother moved out to Queens. Handelman-Meyer attended Bryant High School and then was a member of the first graduating class of the newly opened Queens College. Although her sister gave her a camera upon graduation from high school, she only discovered the New York Photo League during World War II. Okay, so now we're going to head south to Mulberry Street. This is the heart of what at that time was called the Italian immigrant neighborhood. The annual San Gennaro festival regularly attracted crowds to its fair, with food and games of chance designed to raise funds for the Catholic Church and its religious societies. Italian immigrants from Naples established the festival in 1926. Often estranged from an American Catholic Church dominated by Irish clergy, Italian immigrants turned to their hometowns' patron saints. They brought statues of these saints to New York, neighborhoods from Italy. Although most of the year the saints resided in the church basement, where Italian parishioners often were relegated, once a year the faithful would take them out into the streets in a festa that blended religious healing, identification, and the temporary sacralization of profane space. Parades, processions, and festivals turn public thoroughfares into arenas of shared interests, notes the scholar Joseph Sciorra. The paraded image of a saint, he explains, encapsulates a sacred narrative and then superimposes this mytho-historic time onto the everyday sidewalks and street corners. In the San Gennaro festival, mundane and everyday spaces of bus stops and front stoops were transformed into extraordinary, carnivalized, and consecrated sites in dramatic and emotionally charged ways through the display of privileged objects and behaviors. Now, after he returned from military service in World War II, Sid Grossman gravitated particularly to New Yorkers' explicit public performances, such as the San Gennaro Festival. And this photo of Mulberry Street apprehends 2 women and a man standing outside of Ferrara's, a popular Italian-American pastry shop. He catches the interactions of the 2 women against the glowing pastry store, their girth amplifying the appeal of its famous sweet temptations. One woman is holding a flower, and she seems to be speaking to the young man standing and grinning to her left. His left arm is raised so that his hand rests upon his shoulder in a gesture of separation and self-protection. Or maybe he is just a bit shy, but still wants to talk to the woman. Behind and between them stands another woman. She dares both to smile at the young man and to gaze at him. Both women, perhaps sisters, wear flowered dresses in honor of the festival. Grossman had observed exuberant religious expression and self-fashioning on the streets of Panama City when he was serving in the army. Now he gravitated to versions of such public religious performance in his hometown. And here is a shot of what the street looked like at that time. Right? It conveys the press of crowds at the San Gennaro Festival, as well as the grimy block's transformation into a carnival site. Grossman abandoned any sense, oopsie, I'm sorry, that was a mistake. There you go. Grossman abandoned any sense of traditional objective documentation. Instead, he photographed as a participant in the action, explicitly within the physical and emotional reality of the experience. Taken, as you can tell, from an elevated distance, the picture reveals a street transformed. While these religious festivals and processions shared a common connection to Italian-American immigrants who initiated and performed them, the impetus for the San Gennaro Festival came from a group of cafe owners who decided to sell their wares in the street. Subsequently, the festa expanded from a single day to a week-long event, which is still the case, highlighted by a procession of a statue of a saint on Saturday afternoon. The festival was in full swing when I got there, recalled Helen Gee, owner of the Limelight Photo Gallery and Cafe, and that was located right off of Sheridan Square in the 1950s. She went down to Mulberry Street then. Mulberry Street had been cordoned off, and for a half-mile stretch from Chinatown north through the heart of Little Italy, the streets were alive with color. People came from all over to eat, to stroll, to play carnival games, but it was the neighborhood Italians, dressed in their Sunday best, that gave the festival its flavor. And here is a sense of that from Dan Wiener's photograph here. So you can see how well-dressed the men are, guiding San Gennaro along the streets in a parade of floats. His image disrupts the distinctions between normally different city spaces. San Gennaro's smoker fragments sidewalks, buildings, stoops, and streets, obliterating some through its intimate portrayal of the parade. There is no horizon in this photograph. Even the curb of the sidewalk disappears. The man smoking on the float behind the saint and the men accompanying the saint perform a powerful tableau that proclaims simultaneously Italian Catholic and Italian American identity. San Gennaro possesses all his characteristic iconographic properties: mitre, vials of blood, crozier. Behind him, an American flag on the left of the photograph accompanies a large banner topped by a cross. Between the first and second floats can be glimpsed a white-jacketed trumpeter playing music. Wiener's photo displays emotionally powerful and durable demonstrations of affiliation and diversity in a highly concentrated, heterogeneous urban area. Floats carrying the statue of San Gennaro, accompanied by the Italian men who helped to organize the festa, imbued the ordinary streets with a sense of the sacred. Pictures of the San Gennaro Festival on Mulberry Street, which was in those years the heart of Little Italy, capture its sensuous power. The self is constituted at the festa, as the religious studies scholar Robert Orsi has argued, by a kind of religious kinetics in the full gaze of the community. Embodied at the street festival and pictured in Grossman's and Wiener's photographs were what Orsi called essential elements of comportment, the necessary gestures of the Italian-American self. Although the machinery of self-production can be cumbersome and occasionally breaks down, when a performance succeeds, it imputes a firm self to the performer. So I've shown you men, but also women who were important here, as this picture by Grossman. Women played significant roles in the festa. They often carried its emotional and religious meanings. Their piety found expression in public. Two photographs by Grossman of two generations of women on the streets during the festival exemplify Orsi's religious kinetics. The older women navigate the crowded street arm in arm, a mini phalanx. One woman is glancing down. A lottery ticket sticks out of the bag she is carrying. Her age, her somber black dress, and her lowered gaze bespeak her traditionalism and devotion. Her partner is more vibrant. She appears to be talking, her raised eyebrows and hand gesture emphasizing words spoken vigorously. Behind them swirl white shirts of men, while at the edges of the photo appear women's patterned dresses, stripes, and flowers. The fragments of bodies, the singularity of the gesture, and its accompanying stare impress the spectator. One might view this street performance as unguarded or as constitutive of ceremonial public selves. The festa freed women to join in the crush of crowds without any male escort. And here's another shot. Games of chance and the legal opportunity to gamble by purchasing lottery tickets enticed New Yorkers to the festival. In this second photograph by Grossman, two women contemplate their chances to win the raffle. One checks her ticket, the other gazes upward at the board, announcing the winning number, her hand at her mouth. One could be forgiven for assuming that she had been moved religiously. Two older men look at her, sharing in their glances some of her anticipation. Both wear badges on their lapels, indicating that they are members of the San Gennaro Society that sponsors the festival. Behind them, lights arc down the street. Grossman's photographs at the festival capture what the sociologist Irving Goffman called the presentation of self in everyday life. Games of chance played an important role in the festa as a means of raising money for the church. So, how did Sid Grossman, one of the left-wing founders of the New York Photo League, come to take these pictures of the Italian religious street festival? After military service in World War II, including 2 years stationed in Panama, Grossman returned to New York City with waning ideological commitments to communism, coupled with increasing dedication to photography as personal practice. Grossman believed that the function of the photographer is to help people understand the world around them. Although he learned photography largely on his own, he became one of the League's most famous teachers. Sid seldom looked at the students' work. He looked at mine once, and I was elated when he praised it, Guy, a former student, recounted. But what he gave us was more valuable than individual criticism. His passion and commitment were lessons in themselves. For Sid, she explained, photography wasn't a thing apart, not something you did with only half a heart. It called for total involvement. His classes reflected progressive teaching practices, learning by doing. Since he earned little from teaching at the League, he also did freelance photographic work. And during the war, Grossman began to experiment with a small format camera with more sensitive film. He shot a series in Panama on the Black Christ Street Festival with glaring flash, that anticipated his San Gennaro photos. So the war changed photography and introduced new ways of seeing. Pictures were often blurry, grainy, and seemed unposed. Despite censorship by the military that restricted what could be published, war photographs possessed an immediacy that brought a taste of the action to the home front. U.S. authorities only gradually allowed publication of raw images of combat and suffering, including photos of dead GIs. Small 35mm cameras, such as the Contax and Leica used by Robert Capa and other war photographers, were noted for their optical speed and operational flexibility. Since sharp, high-sensitivity film did not become available until after the war, rapid wartime methods of processing film to reach newspapers often produced a grainy effect. Nevertheless, increasingly, 35mm cameras came to be accepted as legitimate professional tools, gradually displacing larger format cameras. Production and consumption of photographs expanded during the war, along with the number of magazines. The conflict transformed the image of photographers. Before the war, photojournalism had been of relatively low status, notes historian Eric Sandine. Public perception of the news photographer matched the persona promoted by Ouija as a hardened, intrusive, flashbulb-popping character. This gradually changed as pictures of combat helped rally women and men on the home front. The war gave photographers a culturally important role to play. At the start of the war, reporters billeted with officers, but photographers slept with enlisted men. By the end of the war, photographers achieved equality with reporters. Candid street photography, personal and expressive, assumed prominence as newcomers arrived in New York City from abroad and from other parts of the United States. They encountered New York initially as strangers, or, as New Yorkers like to say, out-of-towners. Louis Forer came from Philadelphia, the son of working-class Jewish immigrants. Robert Frank came from Switzerland, where he had grown up in a bourgeois Jewish family, sheltered precariously from the Holocaust raging throughout Europe. The two met in New York and shared a darkroom. Forer confronted the city's famous anomie. He too went down to the streets of San Gennaro. But his dual portrait of Robert and Mary Frank as a couple conveys the festa as an apparition. Its lights glow in the background as Mary pensively glances away from Robert, a bag of nuts in her hand. They are looking downwards, apparently watching. A strange statuesque head upstages them both, its one eye gazing unblinkingly out at the world. Forer's photograph enshrines the subjective and experimental that reflected a changing post-war ethos. His double portrait offers a decidedly phantasmagoric picture of the San Gennaro festival's mood. And here's another Forer image. Here, this photo of a boy with items to sell, hats, stuffed animals, and pinwheels, evokes a sense of the bizarre. Three women and a man walking by in the background seem oddly transfixed. The pinwheel handles above their head look weirdly ritualistic, as if passing through timeless space. Reflections of a woman in the background and of pinwheels across the foreground heighten the surrealist feeling of the scene. The oddities of happenstance attracted Forer. Rather than focus on the items for sale, he evokes an insubstantial milieu of people floating among the pinwheels. So perhaps we should end now with another Sonia Handelman-Meyer photograph. Oopsie, I didn't want to end that fast. Okay. This time, the photograph is of a conversation among three women outside of Canera Brothers Bakery in Little Italy. The physical intimacy of conversations among Italian Americans appears in this photograph. The older woman, who apparently works at the bakery, holds a swaddled baby in her arms. She listens intently as another woman, perhaps a regular customer, perhaps a neighbor, emphatically drives her point home with two fingers. The third woman also listens, arms crossed. The bakery features several wrapped cakes on a high shelf. Its sign is missing a few letters. Behind lettering that announces branch of 152 Sullivan Street are long loaves of Italian bread stacked in the window. Handelman-Meyer conveys the mix of childcare responsibilities along with work that working class women juggled. And this conversation, I think, brings us back to where we began, with Jane Jacobs' Eyes on the Street. The women may be talking, but they are surely not unaware of what transpires around them. Thank you. I can stop sharing. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Moore, for that awesome presentation. That was fascinating. So, folks, if you have questions, please go ahead and submit them in the Q&A. I will go ahead and start with some questions. So, you mentioned that folks were coming from all over the country to New York. Were there other cities that drew photographers or had such a unique impact on photography in a way similar to what New York had?
That's a great question. Um, New York really, in part because of the center of printing and publishing in the city, became uh, um, a powerful and influential place for photographers to go. Still photographers, right? Now, if we're talking about people taking films or movies, then we're talking Los Angeles. But for still photographers, New York was the place that just attracted many, many photographers from around the country and also from Europe. And they were attracted because there were so many types of possibilities available, not just your standard, photo, portrait galleries and stuff, but, photojournalism, documentary photography, sports photography, fashion photography. That's the other big area for still photographers. People used to, when advertisements were done in the 30s, they used drawings of the clothing, but gradually photographers pushed out the artists, who would sketch the clothes, and you get the rise of fashion photography. So someone like Richard Avedon is in New York City at the same time as these photographers. I didn't show you any of his photos, but and he's an interesting figure because Avedon was very uncomfortable with street photography. He wanted the control that photography, um, fashion photography gave him. You set the model up, you decide the scene. Even though Avedon is known for taking pictures of models in the streets, he is controlling what happens. And I teach a class. This is not exactly your question, but I'm just going to go off on a tangent here. I teach a class on modern Jewish photographers. And one of the things I assign to the students to do is to pick a photographer whose work they really like. And many of them pick some of these photographers whose work I've shown you, right? And then I said, okay, go out and take pictures just like these photographers is in the same mode. Take pictures like a Dan Wiener or like a Sid Grossman or like a Sonia Handelman-Meyer. And they realize, oh, it's very hard, right? It's very hard to get close enough to people to be able to do that. Now, granted, our attitudes towards photographers have changed in the 21st century, right? And everyone has a camera, in his back pocket. But even so, it's not easy to, you know, take a photograph in as these people did up close, right? Up close and personal. Yeah. So,
Right.
all right. There's a question I think in the chat.
Yes, so were these photos seen at the time by average New Yorkers in newspapers, magazines, or just in artistic settings or books?
So they were not seen in books. Photography hadn't reached that status except if you were, Walker Evans or only Cartier-Bresson. Helen Levitt is one of the few people who does get a book, but which she puts together in these years, but it isn't actually printed until, the early 1960s. So mostly these photographs were seen exhibited in community spaces. So the New School had a photo gallery, the Hudson Guild had a photo gallery, various community spaces around the city where the photographs were often taken were often where they were shown. The Limelight Cafe was unusual because Helen G was committed to photography, and she thought, all right, I'm going to use people buying coffee to underwrite a photo gallery. And she had a gallery as part of her cafe. Now that lasted through much of the 50s. She closed it in 61. And of course, then some of the photographs were seen in newspapers and stuff like that as well. Yeah.
And you mentioned several women photographers. What were some of the challenges they faced at the time? It's actually incredible to hear that there were, so many amazing women photographers at that time.
Yeah. That's another great question. Thank you very much, William. So, look, in those years and even later, if you're a woman on the streets of the city, white men can stare at you, they can make comments about you, they can write, whistle, or whatever. That was considered perfectly acceptable heterosexual white male behavior, right? And they did it to younger women, especially middle class women. So, as a photographer, a woman photographer had to overcome the barrier that she could do the looking. And that's what the camera gave her. It allowed her to look and stare at men and not just, be stared at. But it wasn't easy. And so women had different techniques. Someone like Sonia Handelman Meyer walked the streets of New York, and would go into places that, like Hyatt, she found really interesting. A photographer, let's say like Rebecca Lepkoff, often hung out in the Lower East Side, which was where she lived, until people were comfortable with her presence, and then she would start taking photographs. Helen Levitt often focused on children, and when women took pictures of kids, the kids ignored them because they identified women with mothers, and who pays any attention to mothers? Especially if it's not your mother, which would have been the case with the photographers. So there were different techniques. Vivian Cherry, who worked as a photojournalist, um, also did stuff with kids, but she took photographs of men as well. Yeah, that was a
And then
challenge.
the photographers that you mentioned, how did some of their careers develop, and did the influence of how they took photography at this time remain in their photography and influence their later work?
Okay, so um how did it develop? So some of the photographers died young. I showed you Grossman, he died in his 40s. Wiener went on to a career in photojournalism. He took some incredible photographs in South Africa and also in the Soviet Union, and he was killed in an airplane crash in the late 50s. Um, Forer did continue with a career in photojournalism, and the impact of his work extended into the 60s. Many of the women who married, like Cherry, Vivian Cherry, Sonia Handelman Meyer, Rebecca Lepkoff, stopped taking photographs when they had kids. It was just, too much. Couldn't manage it. And in some cases, they went back to it much later in life. But these were essentially interrupted careers. uh, and there were, I think, I didn't show you these photographers, but for photographers who get started a little later, someone like William Klein or Gary Winogrand or Joel Meyerowitz, they go on to have full careers as in photojournalism or in fashion with Klein or etc. I mean, Winogrand also dies relatively young, actually. Um, so it really varies, but their work, there's a period of time in the 60s and into the mid 70s where people forget about them. They Many of these photographers were left wing, and they suffered due to McCarthyism. The ones who survived the best went into teaching. Walter Rosenblum taught at Brooklyn College. Leipzig taught out on the island. Jaffe, others taught as a way of maintaining their engagement with photography. But in the late 70s, slowly people begin to rediscover their work. So by the 90s, there's a whole it's galleries like Howard Greenberg Gallery and other books. Jane Livingston publishes a book on the New York School, she calls it, of photography, where it's like, wow, they're brought back in to conversation about what photography could be and can be. Yeah.
There don't look there are any more questions. So Professor Moore, thank you again for that incredible presentation. Before I let everybody go, I'm just going to share my screen one more time. And just a reminder that tomorrow down in the Sullivan-Thompson Historic District, we have our holiday shop and stroll. So please come join us for that. And then this Thursday at St. Mark's, we have Labyrinths of Curving Lanes, Greenwich Village, and H.P. Lovecraft. You can find more information about all events that are happening at villagepreservation.org. So I hope to see some of you there at those events. And again, a Village Preservation membership makes a great last minute holiday gift. So go ahead and scan that QR code right there, and you will be able to purchase a membership. But Professor Moore, thank you again for your incredible work and your presentation. That was a real treat. I will say thank you to everyone and happy holidays to you, Professor Moore.
Great. Thanks. It was fun. I'm glad to be able to share with
Thank you
everybody.
so much. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.